Where the heck are they? I said to myself, ducking under a brick archway, going farther into the dark church basement. Shining my phone light around in the room, I saw that it was filled with Christmas decorations. Some of them were in boxes, but some, like the miniature staple for the nativity scene, weren't.
Ted? Rick?
I called. No answer. As I neared the archway to the next room, my light shined on a man facing the far corner, his lower half obscured by stacked boxes. I jumped, sucking in a shocked breath before I realized it was Rick.
Holy crap, man,
I said.
You scared the hell out of me.
Rick didn't respond. He just stood facing the corner. The flannel shirt he always used as a jacket was still on. His shoulders were slumped, but his head was up, like he was looking directly at the wall.
What are you doing, man?
I asked. Still, he didn't answer.
Okay, you got me. Can we just get the meeting started? Where's Ted?
I moved toward him as I said this, dodging around boxes and 3-foot plastic figures of Joseph and Mary. As I stepped around the final obstacle, coming at Rick from his left side, I stepped into something wet. Shining my light down, I saw a puddle of red paint under my boots. I thought that maybe they used the red paint during the Christmas season for something or other. This was, of course, ridiculous. And when I looked back up at Rick, the truth dawned on me. It wasn't paint. It was blood. There was a tall golden candle holder there. It was a kind they'd brought out for Christmas Mass. Only the top of it, the disc-shaped portion that actually held the candle, had been either removed or broken off, and Rick's head had been jammed onto it through his chin. His eyes were open, the fear still apparent in them, just beyond the glossy surface. His mouth was open, and I could see the candle holder protruding through his mouth and into his skull through the roof of his mouth. Blood was all over his mustache and beard, although it now only flowed slowly, dripping sluggishly to the puddle on the floor. I backed away in a panic, tripping and falling backward. My right hand hit something hard, knocking the phone out of my grip. And as the phone fell between two boxes, I found myself in the dark with a corpse. Nearby, something or someone moved. The last meeting of the night was always hit or miss, but it was the only meeting I could attend with my schedule like it was. So as I rounded the corner and came upon the old church, fronting a semi-busy 2-lane street, I was not surprised that no one was outside smoking before the meeting. For a bunch of people who prided themselves on being sober, most of the members smoked like chimneys. In my book, cigarettes and vaping were the same thing, and they were drugs like any other. So I'd quit smoking right around the same time I'd finally quit drinking, after some hard-learned lessons and many years of lying to myself about my problem. The fact that no one was outside smoking told me that it would be a small meeting, which was fine by me. I didn't feel like hanging around for 2 hours tonight, listening to the long-winded stories I'd heard half a dozen times before. But attending the meeting was important. It was how I stayed on track, how I stayed sober. As always, I paused outside of the church and looked around, taking a moment to center myself and appreciate being alive. The Gothic church, grand and tall as it was with its bell tower and prideful architecture, seemed tiny next to the skyscrapers that surrounded it on all sides. The city buzzed and hummed like always. Cars passed on the street. Horns honked on the bigger thoroughfares. Hands in my pockets against the midnight chill, I peered around, breathing deeply. It's good to be alive, I told myself, even if I didn't particularly feel like there was any truth to the words. Some sober days were good, some were bad. Today was a bad one, which was why the meeting was so important.
You got $1?
A man said from behind me. I turned and looked. It was a homeless guy I'd come to know over the last month of attending meetings here. He said his name was Tractor, which I knew wasn't right. Then again, I knew he was developmentally disabled, so I just called him Tractor. He was in his mid-20s, with a patchy brown beard and matted blonde hair. He had a ratty sleeping bag wrapped around him, his eyes cast down at my feet.
Hey, Tractor,
I said. How you doing tonight? Have you eaten? Tractor shook his head once, still looking down.
You got $1? Yeah, of course, man,
I said, reaching for my wallet.
You want to come in and get some coffee and a donut?
He shifted on his feet and glanced around, looking everywhere but in my eyes. I knew it was no good. No matter how many times I offered, he always answered with silence. I pulled a 20 out of my wallet and handed it to him. I knew it was too late for him to get into a shelter for the night, but at least he could go to sleep with a hot meal in his stomach. He took the 20 and nodded in thanks, still not meeting my eyes. Then he headed down the sidewalk. I turned and walked up the steps, opening one of the heavy and ornate wooden doors, stepping inside. Moving through the narthex and into the nave, I saw that the renovations were still going on. Most of the pews had been moved aside, and the place was draped in plastic sheeting. There were towers of scaffolding here and there, reaching up to the cathedral ceiling to repair the damage that someone had done just over a week earlier. I couldn't imagine who would want to trash the inside of a church, especially one like this. Father McReady was so welcoming of anyone and everyone. He was a true community preacher, and he was happy enough to let us alcoholics and drug addicts have our meeting in his basement. Sometimes, he even sat in on the meetings, although he didn't do much talking. I doubted very much if he'd ever had a drink outside of sacrament. Still, that didn't change the fact that someone had trashed the place. According to Father McReady, he usually left the church doors unlocked overnight, so homeless folks could sleep inside if it got too cold or it rained. But when he'd come in bright and early on Monday morning last week, he'd found that someone had taken advantage of that open door policy. They'd taken some of the candle holders from the stage and used them to scratch up the pews and smash the expert craftsmanship on the wood-paneled walls. They'd thrown bricks at the ceiling and at a couple of the stained glass windows, and they'd carved obscenities in the wooden pillars at the sides of the nave. I didn't know who would do such a thing, but I wanted to get my hands on them and teach them a thing or two about life. Not that I ever thought I would get the chance. I knew the crime would likely go unpunished. It was a damn shame. Pushing an opaque plastic sheet aside, I moved to the door at the side of the nave, and as I put my hand on the ornate doorknob, I heard a door slam near the vestry. I paused and looked over my shoulder, although I couldn't see to the pulpit because of the plastic sheeting.
Father McReady?
There was no answer. But as I turned my attention back to the door, my eyes caught on a faint silhouette of a man standing behind a sheet of plastic. The sight jarred me, and I looked closer, making sure I wasn't imagining things. Although it was faint, I was fairly certain there was someone standing over there, beyond a sheet or two of the cloudy plastic.
Hello?
I said.
Rick, is that you?
Rick was the one guy who was at every late-night meeting because he was the one who ran them. He bought donuts or cookies, brewed the coffee, and set up the chairs. I stepped away from the door to the basement and walked toward the plastic sheeting, but as I did, the man moved. Hustling over to the plastic sheet, I swiped it away. There was no one there. Peering around, I saw no evidence of anyone. Then again, the way the church was right now, there were about 100 places to hide. Grumbling, I headed back and walked down the narrow staircase. The basement had a low ceiling and was made of exposed brick. It was not the most cozy place in the world, despite the slightly claustrophobic feeling I got thanks to the low ceiling. The building had been constructed in the middle of the 19th century, and people had gotten a lot taller since then. I ducked under an archway and into the room we used for meetings, surprised to find no one sitting there waiting, not even Rick. The folding chairs were in a circle, waiting patiently for the meeting to start. I wondered who would be here tonight. Sometimes it was only 3 or 4 of us at the late meetings. And man, did some of the meetings get dark really quick. But that was kind of the point. It was meant to be cathartic. And it was anonymous. You weren't supposed to tell anyone outside the group about the things you heard in there. Still, in the early days when I was really struggling with sobriety, I left meetings wanting a drink more than ever. Hearing all the terrible things people did when they were drunk or drugged up could drive even a lifelong teetotaler to drink. But I stuck with it. Things got better, and I came to depend on the meetings. But there could be no meeting without other people. Taking off my jacket, I looked over at the folding table at the side of the poorly lit room. There was a box of donuts there, and the percolator was on. So Rick was here somewhere. As I stepped toward the circle of chairs, I saw a jacket I recognized. It was a leather one, draped over one of the seat backs. The jacket belonged to a guy named Ted. I didn't know his last name. I figured both Ted and Rick would come downstairs any moment, so I grabbed myself a coffee and sat down to wait. Minutes ticked by. I sipped my coffee and thought about what I wanted to discuss. I still haven't forgiven myself for some of the things I'd done. One thing in particular stuck in my mind, but I was getting there. I'd been following the steps, making amends to the people I'd wronged. The people I could make amends to anyway. After several minutes, I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. The meeting was supposed to start at 11. It was 12 after.
What the heck is going on?
I said to myself, getting up from my seat. The church basement was pretty large, with an assortment of rooms separated by low brick archways. Most of the rooms were used for storage, but I decided to take a look around before trying upstairs. The memory of the man standing silently behind the plastic sheet was still bugging me, and I didn't really want to go up there if I didn't have to. So I set my half-empty coffee cup down on the folding table and stepped to the archway that led to the next room over. It was dark, allowing me to only see the shapes of stacked chairs and tables.
Rick?
I called out.
Ted?
There was no answer. I found the light switch on the wall and flipped it. Nothing happened.
Oh, great,
I said. Pulling out my phone and turning on the flashlight, I headed deeper into the basement. Shining the light around the room, I found that it was empty of people. There were only chairs and folding tables. So I moved into the next room.
Where the heck are they?
I said to myself. The room was filled with Christmas decorations. I moved through the space, shining my light around. And as I neared the archway to the next room, my light caught on a figure facing the corner. I jumped, sucking in a shocked breath before I realized it was Rick.
Holy crap, man,
I said.
You scared the hell out of me.
Rick didn't respond. He just stood facing the corner.
What are you doing, man?
I asked. Still, he didn't answer.
Okay, you got me. Can we just get the meeting started? Where's Ted?
I moved toward him as I said this, stepping around boxes and decorations. As I stepped around the final obstacle, coming at Rick from his left side, I stepped into something wet. At first, I thought it was paint, but when I looked back up at Rick, the truth dawned on me. It wasn't paint, it was blood. Rick's head had been impaled on the tall candle holder. He was dead, I realized with mounting panic. I grunted and backed away, tracking blood with me. The back of my legs hit a box of decorations and I toppled over. As I put my arms back to try and cushion my fall, I hit something hard with my right hand, knocking the phone out of my grip. The light immediately went out as the phone fell into a crack between a couple of boxes. I was suddenly alone in the dark with a corpse. Nearby, something or someone moved. Scrambling up, I ran toward the exit, tripping once again over stored decorations and falling into the aisle. I looked to my right, back toward the meeting room, and saw a figure standing there in the archway, backlit by the dim lights in the distant meeting room. I couldn't see his features or make out the details of his clothes, but I could see that he had something in his right hand, some sort of blunt weapon. I froze, still on all fours, looking toward him.
Ted?
I asked. The man moved, stalking toward me. It wasn't Ted. I could tell by the way he moved. His posture promised violence. I lunged to my feet and ran the other way, deeper into the dark basement. The man's footsteps followed. They grew faster. Soon, he was running after me. The farther away I got from the source of light, the more trouble I had seeing things until they were right in front of me, which was how I nearly missed the staircase that I hadn't known was there. I'd never been this far into the church basement, so the stairs were a surprise. But as the slapping footsteps grew closer, I wasted little time, bouncing up the narrow staircase. The door at the top of the stairs was much like the one in the nave. It had no lock, so when I opened it and found myself in a room in the back of the church with bookcases and a desk, I slammed the door and had no way to lock it. The footsteps came up the stairs as I looked at a bookcase next to the door. I grabbed the side of the case up high and yanked it toward me. The opposite side came up a few inches, but then fell back to the carpeted floor. The footsteps on the other side of the door were closing. Once again, I yanked the bookcase. This time, I put enough into it to bring the thing down. Books crashed out of it as it hit the ground directly in front of the door. Just a second later, the doorknob turned and the door opened an inch before it hit the shelf. Slamming my hands against the door over the sideways shelf, I succeeded in closing it all the way. I stayed like that for a long moment, expecting the murderer to try and break through. But the door didn't move again, and I could hear nothing from the other side over my heavy breathing. Realizing he might be coming up the other way, I stepped away from the door and headed for the exit. There was another door in the front of what I had assumed was Father McCready's office. I pulled the door open and found myself in a hallway. I'd never been in this part of the church before, but I knew from the layout which general direction to head. After moving down the hallway and through another door, I found myself in the area where the choir stood during services. The front doors weren't far. Moving as fast as I could, I headed across the stage and past the pulpit. As I stepped off the stage and moved past a plastic sheet, I glanced up at the scaffolding, and I saw Ted. He was hanging from a rope around his neck, one used to bring supplies up and down the scaffolding. His face was discolored, his body limp as it swayed gently next to the scaffolding. I stared up at him for a long moment before self-preservation overcame my shock, and I faced forward, determined to get outside and find help. But I had only taken a step when something hard hit me in the back of the head. I stumbled and, unable to keep my feet, fell to all fours. Footsteps came from behind me. They were soft, as if the person wasn't wearing shoes. I turned my head, but before I could get eyes on my attacker, they hit me again in the head, knocking me unconscious.
Mac,
a voice said. The sound of my name brought me slowly through the veil of unconsciousness. As I came back to myself, the pain in my head was like a bucket of freezing water thrown on me. My eyes snapped open, and I moaned, remembering that I'd just seen Ted hanging by his neck in the nave. And before that, I'd seen Rick, his head impaled on a candle holder. I was lying on my side on some coarse floorboards, the air around me chilly. I couldn't see anything but an exposed brick wall with thick metal supports, spaced every 3 feet or so.
Mac, wake up,
the voice said again. I realized I recognized it. As I tried to move, I realized my wrists were bound together with tape behind my back. My ankles were bound together as well. I rolled awkwardly onto my back, carefully not to let my injured head touch the boards underneath me. Partially resting on my arms, I looked over to see one of the regulars from our late-night meetings, Luke. He sat against the wall, back propped between 2 metal supports. His arms were also bound behind his back, forcing him to sit at an angle. His ankles were likewise wrapped in tape. Unlike me, he was still wearing his jacket, and he didn't seem to have any injuries I could see.
Luke,
I asked.
What's happening? Did you see who it was?
Luke shook his grizzled head, his droopy eyelids half raised over bloodshot eyes. He was in his late 40s, but like most of us, he'd done some hard living and looked so much older.
He was wearing a mask,
he said.
What did he sound like?
I asked.
Was it Father McCready? Father McCready?
Luke said.
Are you nuts? He wouldn't do nothing like this. No way. I don't want to believe it either, but I didn't see him anywhere. And he's always here until after the last meeting. It wasn't the father, okay?
Luke said.
I know what McCready sounds like, and it wasn't him. It was someone else. What does he want? I don't know,
Luke said.
Can you get up?
I struggled up into a sitting position, placing my hands behind my tailbone to help keep me up. I looked around the square space. It wasn't very large, maybe 15 feet on a side. There was a steep metal staircase leading up to a square hole in the ceiling. Beyond the hole, I could see nothing but darkness. There was another near vertical staircase leading down from a similar hole nearby. It was dark through that hole too. The only reason I could see anything was because a single work light had been hooked to a crossbeam on one of the narrow railings flanking the staircase leading upward. The extension cord trailed down to the lower level.
We're in the bell tower?
I said. Luke nodded.
How the hell did I get up here?
I asked.
Listen,
Luke said, glancing down at the hole in the floor.
What did you do? What did I do? What the hell are you talking about? I'm tied up just like you are.
Luke shook his head.
No, not tonight. I mean, what did you do before you got sober? You've hinted at meetings about what you did, but you never said it outright. So what was it? What did you do that was so bad?
I fixed my gaze on Luke.
Why are you asking me this? Because this is about one of us,
he said.
It has to be. Why does it have to be about one of us? Rick and Ted are both dead. They're dead, Luke. If it was about one of us, wouldn't we be dead too? That's exactly my point. We're still alive. That means something. It means he's not done. It means he wants something from us.
Luke glanced at the hole in the floor again.
Did you talk to him, Luke? Did he say this is about me? About what I did? What exactly did you do? Screw this,
I said, scooting back so I was against the wall opposite Luke.
I'm getting the hell out of here.
I managed to use the wall to get to my feet after a couple of tries.
What are you going to do?
Luke asked.
Hop down the staircase? You might as well just throw yourself headfirst through the hole. The end result will be the same.
He was right. Both staircases were so steep, they were almost like ladders. They had shallow metal railings alongside, but they wouldn't help me with my hands bound behind my back. Still, I figured I could at least try to worm my way down by planting my butt on one step and my feet on another.
Mac, don't do it. You can't go. Just tell me what you did and this will be all over.
Ignoring Luke, I hopped toward the hole, determined to at least try to escape. Otherwise, I was sure I was going to die. But as I got to the hole and peered down, I saw a white face staring up at me. But it wasn't a real face. It was a man dressed in black and wearing a blank white mask. He held a pistol pointed up at me, and he shook his head. I quickly hopped out of the way, scared he was going to shoot me. Once I was to relative safety, I looked over at Luke. Tears were streaming down his face.
Just tell me what you did,
he said.
Just tell me so I can go home. I want to go home. What is this?
I asked.
This is all about me, isn't it?
Luke nodded.
You're the one he wants the most. But he said he needs you to admit what you did. He said if I could get you to admit it, he would let me go. He promised. Who is it?
I shouted.
I don't know.
Luke screamed back.
Who are you?
I shouted toward the hole. The sound of footsteps on metal stairs started up. He was coming.
Please!
Luke shouted.
Please, just tell him. Save my life and tell him.
I shook my head and jumped back once more.
I can't!
I fell back against one of the metal supports at the wall, my left arm scraping along a rough edge. Then I realized what I had to do. I had to tell them what I'd done. I had to do it. It was my only chance. The fire crackled in the middle of the campsite, fighting fitfully against the encroaching night. Me and 3 of my buddies sat around the fire, joking and drinking. We had never been the types to go hiking miles into the woods to camp. Instead, we opted for finding a nice clear spot in the woods where we could park our vehicles and unload right there. We were all in our late 20s, having met in college. And it was the one time a year we got together anymore. And although we'd mellowed since our college days, the night still seemed so early and full of possibility. Although I'd been drinking for a couple of hours at that point, I didn't feel drunk. So when my buddy Ross asked if anyone wanted to go joyriding, I volunteered immediately. Joyriding was something we'd done in our college days in these very woods before we all went our separate ways. We would pile onto the outside of someone's SUV, usually Dante's, with our feet on the running boards or the back bumper and our hands on the luggage rack. Then we'd take turns driving while going around the woods on the rough dirt roads, laughing and joking around as we bumped along the uneven ground. It was something we'd turned into a kind of tradition. Granted, in those days, there had been many more of us. One time, we'd gone joyriding with nearly 12 people on the sides and back of the SUV. On straight and relatively flat stretches, we could get up to 30 miles an hour or so. Sure, it was stupid, but we were young, and it was thrilling and not really all that dangerous, at least not during the day. When Ross asked if anyone wanted to go, it was fully dark out. But we weren't going to let that stop us from having a good time. My other 2 buddies, Dante and Boyd, declined.
Just the 2 of us,
Ross said to me.
We'll take my Tahoe. I'll drive first.
He got into the driver's seat and rolled down the windows, while I got on the running board outside the front passenger seat, holding onto the handle just inside the window with one hand. I had a full beer in my other hand, which I finished in short order. Ross drove for a while, playing music over the car speakers in the otherwise silent woods. We laughed and chatted about old times as the SUV bumped over holes, sped around corners, and moved like a roller coaster up and down the small hills in the area. Then it was my turn to drive and we switched spots. As soon as I got behind the wheel, I knew I shouldn't have been driving. But I ignored that little voice in my head. And as I steered the vehicle through the woods, Ross shouted for me to go faster.
And turn it up! I love this song!
Smiling, I hit the gas and turned up the volume. It felt good to be cruising along with one of my best friends, the cool night wind whipping through the windows. We hit a straightaway, and I gave it more gas, not paying attention to the speedometer. Not paying attention to anything but the thrill and the freedom and the comforting buzz in my head. The comforting buzz that was also slowing my reaction time and messing with my ability to make rational decisions. We must have been doing nearly 50 miles an hour when the headlights picked out the sharp left turn up ahead. But it took too long for the information to process in my mind, and then we were bearing down on the turn. I slammed on the brakes and yanked the wheel to the left, panic constricting my throat. The wheels lost traction on the dirt road. The SUV slid sideways and then went off the road, going airborne as the right wheels hit the rocky ground. Ross screamed as the vehicle barrel rolled through the air. Then there was only the sound of shattering glass and rending metal as the SUV landed on its roof and rolled once more before smashing into a tree. Although I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt, I somehow managed to stay in the vehicle. And as it came to a violent stop, I was still holding the steering wheel. The roof smashed down to within an inch of my head.
Ross!
I screamed into the night.
Ross, are you okay?
I got the door open, although it was severely dented, and lurched into the woods, calling for my friend. But he never answered. He'd been thrown into a tree, his skull fractured. He was dead. And by the time I made it back to camp to tell my friends and get my phone to call the police, I had made up a story about how Ross had been driving and he'd been thrown from the vehicle. I said I'd been in the front passenger seat, wearing my seatbelt. Although Dante and Boyd looked at me like they knew I was lying, they never questioned my story. Since they'd seen Ross driving when we'd left the camp, and since it was Ross's SUV, they couldn't prove otherwise, and neither could the police. After all, we'd only taken 2 cars into the woods that night, and I'd ridden with Ross, even doing a couple of hours of driving. So it made sense for my fingerprints to be on the steering wheel. I was never charged with a crime.
Is that what you wanted to hear?
I shouted down at the hole after finishing the story. The man still hadn't come up all the way, but I knew he was down there, just out of view. I'd stayed where I was, up against the steel support beam the whole time. And with little movements, I'd been rubbing the tape around my wrists against the sharp corner that had scratched me when I'd fallen against it earlier. Clearly, Luke had seen what I was doing, but he hadn't said anything. I think he knew, somewhere deep down, that he wouldn't be walking out of here alive if the man in the mask had his way. Now, my wrists were all but free. All it would take was a forceful rip to free my arms. But I needed to bide my time. I needed to get the man with the gun up here so I could make my move. Otherwise, I had no way out of the church tower.
I killed Ross! I killed him! It was my fault. Now what?
The man in the mask came up the ladder, poking his gun up through the hole just as he poked his head through. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood up, but from underneath the mask, I could see evidence of a brown beard. I thought about jumping at him as he stepped up into the room, but he was still too far away, and the gun was rock steady on me. With my ankles still bound, I would only get one chance at this.
You got $1?
The man asked, eyes smiling behind the mask. My world seemed to flip upside down.
Tractor?
I breathed. The man reached up and took the mask off, revealing the homeless man's face. It was Tractor. He smiled at me, meeting my eyes for the first time ever.
What?
I said, confusion jumbling my thoughts.
Who are you? You don't see the resemblance?
He said, stepping out of the hole in the floor.
I mean, Ross and I had different fathers, but we both got our mother's eyes.
Even as he said the words, I did see the resemblance. The eyes were just the same.
His brother?
I asked. Tractor said nothing, just smiled without humor.
How did you find me?
It was all I could think to ask.
How do you think?
Tractor said.
Your friends Boyd and Dante knew your story was full of shit. They knew it was your fault. He did it!
Luke suddenly shouted, interrupting.
He told you! Now let me go!
Without so much as a glance that way, Tractor whipped the gun toward Luke and fired twice, blasting 2 holes in the man's chest. I jumped forward on tensed legs, ripping my arms apart and bringing them forward as I did. Tractor was whipping the gun back toward me, but I managed to shove him with outstretched arms before he could get it back on target. I fell to the floor and Tractor took a wild step back, but there was no floor under his foot. His right leg fell into the hole. He tried to catch himself before falling down, but he wasn't able. He disappeared down the hole with a clatter and a grunt. Reaching down to my feet, I found the end of the tape and ripped it up, unwinding the binds. When I got the tape from around my ankles, I eased over toward the hole, looking for Tractor, or whatever his name was. A gun fired from below, and I jerked my head back, feeling the bullet pass close in front of my face. Then I heard the heavy sound of a clumsy footstep on a metal stair. He was coming up. I had no other choice. I had to go up toward the top of the tower. Maybe I can climb down to the church roof, I thought, as I hustled up the steep staircase. Coming into the next room, I saw 3 large bells, all supported by a steel framework and surrounded by complicated mechanisms that could ring them remotely from elsewhere in the church without pulling on a rope. There was a ladder affixed to the wall next to the bells, leading to a closed door in the ceiling. There was a savage scream from below. Tractor was coming. I moved up the ladder as fast as I could, pushing the door open and allowing the chilly night air to swoop in. Climbing up, I found myself at the top of the church tower. I slammed the door and then stepped to the nearest edge, looking between 2 columns that helped support a roof with a cross on top. There was a lip that came up to my thighs. As I was looking for a way to climb down, I sensed movement behind me. I turned around just in time to see Father McCready rushing toward me. He shoved me into the gap between the 2 columns. I fell back, stopping myself by hooking my fingers onto the inside of the columns, but Father McCready kept hands on my chest, pushing me. My legs were still hooked over the lip, but I knew if my hands slipped off, I would fall down to the steep church roof, which was a good 50 feet down. Then I would surely slide off the church roof. I doubted I would survive.
Father, please,
I said, looking into the man's eyes. I'd only ever seen kindness and empathy in those eyes. Now I saw something much different. I saw rage.
Why are you doing this? I've tried things the kind way, the New Testament way,
he said.
It doesn't work. I just get walked all over. People spit on my church floor. They piss in the corners and between the pews, and I have to come in and clean it up in the morning.
My fingers were slipping. Father McCready was still shoving, but I was shocked into silence.
And then there's you people,
he continued.
You alcoholics and drug addicts. I don't know how you can live with yourself, the things you've done. Listening to your stories makes me sick. You killed someone for God's sake, and you never even had the good grace to come clean about it. You killed someone, and you're still walking around free. That's not justice. I've tried to be a good person,
I said, pinky fingers slipping off the columns.
I tried. Too late,
McCready said.
Now it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. Now it's a life for a life.
Behind him, I saw Tractor throw open the door in the floor. They were working together, I realized. That was how they got me into the room that evening, even though I was unconscious. That was how one of them had managed to sneak up on me. The rest of my fingers were slipping. McCready was still shoving me back out of the tower. And with a clarity I'd been searching for my entire sober life, I saw that he was right. I didn't deserve to live after what I'd done. I'd never been punished for it. Not until now. I let go of the columns and tumbled out of the tower, spinning slowly in the air as I rushed toward my death. And before I hit the church roof, before my spine snapped like a stale twig, I had a brief moment of peace. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and smash that like button to get notified every time I upload a new video. You can also check out some more of my animated horror stories right here.